Just before we kick off this afternoon's session, moving on to innovations, what we wanted to do is to feed back to you from the groups that have gone before the break. So with me are Nate Matthews, Peter Harvey and Tom Slaymaker, who are each going to briefly introduce themselves and then just share some of their thoughts about what really excited them from the sessions before the break, so that you get an understanding of the sessions you weren't at and some of the discussions that may have gone on. So I think we have Tom first to talk about Bangladesh.
Do you want to just touch anything? Okay, thank you. My name's Tom Slaymaker. I work for UNICEF in headquarters, and I work on the Joint Monitoring Programme for Water Supply and Sanitation. I was sat in the session on Bangladesh, which was a very rich discussion and almost impossible to summarise in 5 minutes, but I will just pull out a few things that seem to be of interest coming out of the panel. And clearly, I think everyone recognises what a complex hydrological setting we're looking at in Bangladesh. Very challenging. But it was also important, I think, that people acknowledged the huge progress that has been made in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of improving food security over the years. And so, although there's some very big challenges remaining, I think the discourse has perhaps shifted a little bit away from a sort of victim to a fighter, which was a comment that somebody made. But there's also been clearly a big shift in focus. So while there's been a long-standing focus on floods, a lot of work has been done on the issue of flooding, and now attention is shifting towards other issues, in particular scarcity and pollution, and these have attracted much less research and also much less investment. And there's therefore a shift, if you like, away from dealing with very large or extreme risks to dealing with multiple interconnected smaller risks, which are equally, if not more important. And then another theme that came out, at least for me, was that although there has perhaps been a sort of increasing or improving collective water security in some cases, that hasn't necessarily led to improved water security for the entire population, and that the distribution of those benefits is very uneven. So to give a few examples, the big focus on infrastructure rather than the environment has meant that the poorer and more vulnerable populations who rely more heavily and more closely on rivers and local ecosystems have not felt the benefit, and in fact fish stocks have declined, for example. Traditional inland waterways and transport systems have become more difficult for people to navigate. So a very dynamic system, and there's a lot of discussion about what's going on with sort of high flows and low flows, and in particular this whole issue of salinity. And recognising that people are able to adapt in various ways and to innovate, and that perhaps there's a growing recognition that the solution is less about prescribing responses and more about enabling people to respond, and they do in very interesting ways. I mean, there's a lot of discussion of the coastal regions and the fact that the population there is actually declining. People are perhaps moving out, which could be seen as a positive or a negative, but could also be seen as part of a coping strategy, and that enabling people to move around and to diversify their livelihood sources is going to be important. I think we heard that it is possible to model some of these flows, particularly the environmental flows, the water flows, and to increasingly predict different possible scenarios based on recent experience. And that the key then is not to identify one response, but a number of different options, and to try and focus the discussion in terms of decision-making on some of the trade-offs. So there are various different possible responses at the local level and at the regional and national level. But there will be inevitably trade-offs in terms of those responses, and those need to be much better understood in terms of the distribution of benefits. And that while everyone agrees local solutions are important, and that is clearly reflected in policies and programs in recent years, and the importance of participation, that ultimately the success of those local programs, which is so inextricably linked in terms of their success to what's going on within the wider hydrological system, depends on being able to coordinate with other levels. The last sort of major point of discussion, I think, was on the role of private sector and a recognition that private sector has an important role to play. We had a speaker from Marks and Spencer who talked about the importance of securing the supply chain, cleaner production and reduced water use, but also promoting improved welfare for the workforce and consumers. And there were some interesting reflections at the end from the audience, particularly on what is the incentive for private sector. I mean, we heard a lot about private sector at the international level having a clear incentive to engage in terms of water security. But what's the incentive at the local level, and how does that work? Is it about consumers driving the way in which private sector responds, or is this something which is integral to the supply chain? There was also a very interesting discussion around whether, and we talk about water security, but whether a kind of single sector approach is really going to be helpful, and how we can make these links that were so clearly highlighted to food security, employment, transport, perhaps less so energy in Bangladesh, but certainly links to other sectors. And then this recurring theme about productivity and efficiency within the system as a whole, and where we can seek to increase gains. But a very rich discussion, and that's a very brief summary.
Great. Thanks for that, Tom. I'll now pass over to Nate to feedback on Ethiopia. There are certainly some keywords there that linked across the discussions between from what you've said about Bangladesh and what we saw in the Ethiopia discussion. It should be on. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I'm Nate, or Nathaniel Matthews. I'm with the CGIAR research program on water, land, and ecosystems. And we're led by the International Water Management Institute. So yes, we had a great panel as well in the Ethiopia session with a really stimulating discussion from everyone. And so apologies in advance if I miss anything. One of the advantages of being a rapporteur is getting to apply my own filters to the discussion. So here we go. So we started off by being reminded of the challenges. We know there's increased climate variability due to climate change in an already variable climate across the country. There are 8 million people who receive food aid this year in the country, roughly the population of London, to put that in perspective. Land degradation is a serious problem affecting crop productivity and also sediment into hydropower dams, sedimentation of dams. There are uncoordinated water abstractions across the country, with lakes and wetlands also drying up. And the private sector and FDI offers both opportunities and challenges for the future. It was raised about the point of the planned infrastructure that's going in across the country. Many of the dams are untested to the climate variability that occurs in Ethiopia. And many people are really at the edge of poverty in the country right now. So they might have been just above the poverty line, but the current drought has pushed them back into poverty. So we need a higher lift with those people. And that's due mainly to their reliance on subsistence farming, which isn't a way out of poverty. So we thought what was needed is really a transformation away from small-scale agriculture. And this has to be both a social and economic transformation. So it has both governance and economic dimensions. And this transformation is a key part of the Ethiopia government's concept of the growth and transformation plan. So it's not talking about growth at any cost. It's really talking about transformation with the growth, and that being a key aspect. So that we then turned, after the challenges, to really thinking about what role of science and the REACH program has into meeting some of these grand challenges. And it was raised that many of the solutions and science that are needed already exist, and the difficulties are in delivery and translating these into politically feasible and attractive levels. And also trade-offs. That was a key thing that was raised repeatedly. So trade-offs need to be considered, and when we talk about trade-offs, who are we talking about those trade-offs for? How do we ensure that trade-offs are not all borne by the less powerful, by the poor, by the environment, which often, and women as well, which often don't have the voices in the halls of power where decisions are made. And so these transformations that we're talking about, they have an important gender dimension, something that needs to be considered if we are really going to reduce poverty, especially over the long term, and not just give people a little lift that can then go back into it. So I thought we came out with the idea that REACH needs to reach out to a wider spectrum of stakeholders in addition to policymakers, and really engage with advocacy groups, with NGOs, with universities, with a wide range, if they're going to create this change in 7 years. And we also said that change lurches forward. I quite like this concept that came up. And one direction for REACH might be to identify these crunch points and a suite of ready-made options that could be used for politicians to consider. And this echoes some of Dustin's words yesterday. We don't waste a crisis, but don't wait for one. And finally, we talked about the fact that solutions that we're looking for are not often going to be found in the water sector. They're often going to be outside of the water sector. So we need to link the REACH program to the solutions that are being developed in other sectors, and really ensure that we're not reinventing the wheel, and that we're taking on those lessons, both the good and bad, and learning them moving forward.
Thanks very much, Nate. And now, Peter, were your discussions in Kenya as lively as all the rest of them? Thanks, on.
Well, they were quite different. We had a very engaged group, but perhaps not the most efficient, because the chair started with 4 questions, and I think we only addressed the first one. But nonetheless, it was an interesting topic, and it was mainly around what role innovation has in addressing water security for the poor. I mean, Kenya has chronic water scarcity. 80% of the country is classed as arid or semi-arid land. If we look at the JMP figures, the rural population, about 43% still lack access to safe water. And in urban, there's actually been an increase since 1990, from 8% without access to 18%. So a lot of rural-urban migration, still the overall burden within rural areas, but increasing pressures and challenges within the urban sphere. In talking about innovation, it was agreed, I think, almost unanimously, that we're not talking about technology primarily. That may have a role to play in certain spheres, but we really focus more on how we should work to try and reduce or increase water security. Certainly getting better at working together. Now, of course, it's very easy to say, much more difficult to do. But working better across the understanding the role of business in the private sector and working more closely with them, as well as with government and development agencies and academia. But one of the key challenges is how to influence policy and decision makers. It was quoted by one person that we talk about science into policy, but do policy makers actually want that science? Some argue that yes, they do. If you go to a decision maker or policy maker, they want hard figures, but they want certainty. They want it to be black and white. And of course, water issue is a very complex issue, very political. So we may not always be able to give that information. So we also need to understand what kind of pressures decision makers are under, what conflicts they have to deal with, as well as the conflicts that there are from both benefits in river basins and benefits from river basins, and understanding that as well. We can see science as a service to policymakers. So not just come up with a science and then hope it will somehow magically transform itself into policy, but really providing a useful service to decision makers, and looking at different ways of influencing emotional connections as well as scientific. The next area of discussion was mainly around community engagement. We talked about the hardware-software sort of balance, Someone coined the phrase hardware to heartware, addressing the real social and behavioural and emotional aspects. It's felt that although we've been talking about demand-responsive approaches for probably the last 20, 30 years, we talk a lot about community consultation and engagement. A lot of that is not really serious. It's paying lip service. We may not always be sincere, and in some cases we already know what we want to do before we actually consult. And this is an area that really needs to be given much more emphasis to find out what the needs and desires of the people who are in the most vulnerable, marginalised, remote areas of the country actually need, including pastoralist communities that obviously have mobility in terms of how they move. A lot of what's been done in Kenya and many other countries have been a lot of pilots of different approaches, but we need to go to scale quickly. Talking about pilots, I started thinking about flying because I recently had some flying lessons. And if you get in an aeroplane and your pilot's going nowhere, you would probably ask for some money back. But with the pilots we do in development, they often go nowhere. That's exactly where they go. Very few actually go to scale. So is it really an effective use of resources? We need to be looking at solutions at scale, moving to scale quickly. Monitoring impact rather than inputs or outputs. What is the actual impact of what we're doing? How do we measure it? Do we have viable ways to measure that? Lastly, in just looking at the REACH project, it's important that we have good social science balanced with the more technical water resources science, and that we need to ensure that we have an integrated approach, a balanced approach. As someone said, it's not business as usual, but business unusual. Thank you.
Thanks very much to our panellists and to our rapporteurs, and also to the panellists and to the chairs who gave us such stimulating discussions earlier on. Certainly speaking on behalf of the Ethiopia one, I think there's a lot that we'll take away in how we think about the research we're doing there and how we're engaging with policymakers in that space. So thanks very much again to the rapporteurs and to everyone for the engagement in that session.